It began on a cool October morning in 2018, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. John Miller, 42 years old, was not a reckless man. He worked as an electrician in Asheville, steady and dependable, the kind of person neighbors trusted when the lights went out or when a storm blew shingles from a roof. He was a father of two, devoted to his wife, but especially close to his teenage son, Daniel. 14 years old, Daniel was quiet, lanky, with a love for baseball and video games, but he also cherished the time spent outdoors with his father. Hiking had always been their ritual. John believed the wilderness was a teacher. It tested patience, demanded awareness, and offered silence in a world too full of noise. Every fall, when the leaves burned red and orange across the ridges, he and Daniel would take at least one trip together into the mountains. A day for just the two of them. No distractions, no schedules. On the morning of October 15th, 2018, they left home early. John loaded their pickup truck with light packs, a tent, 2 sleeping bags, trail mix, water bottles, a flashlight, and his old compass. It wasn't intended to be an overnight trip, but John liked to be prepared. He parked near Coldwater Gap, a popular trailhead that wound into the heart of the Blue Ridge. Several hikers saw them that morning. Witnesses described John in a faded green jacket, smiling as he adjusted his pack. Daniel followed close behind, wearing a navy baseball cap, fiddling with the straps of his backpack the way restless kids do when they are both excited and uncertain. Around 10:30 a.m., they stepped into the trees. That was the last confirmed sighting of either of them. When dusk fell and they hadn't returned, John's wife, Sarah, wasn't immediately alarmed. John sometimes liked to extend hikes, to pitch a tent when the air was clear and the stars were bright. But by late morning the next day, when there was still no word, her worry hardened into fear. She called the sheriff's office. Within hours, deputies and rangers were on the trail. They expected to find signs of the pair quickly. A campfire, a trail of footprints, a discarded wrapper, something, but there was nothing. By nightfall on October 16th, helicopters were circling the ridge, searchlights cutting across the treetops. Dozens of volunteers combed the woods with flashlights, calling the names of the missing father and son. Bloodhounds followed scent trails for only a few hundred yards before circling back in confusion. The forest gave nothing. The Asheville Times reported the next day. Authorities have launched an intensive search for John Miller, 42, and his son, Daniel, 14, after the pair failed to return from a day hike in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Sheriff Alan Brewer stated that more than 60 volunteers, supported by helicopters and K-9 units, scoured the trails near Coldwater Gap throughout the night, but found no trace of the missing hikers. As the news spread, the Miller family's quiet street in Asheville filled with cars. Friends, relatives, even strangers gathered, some offering casseroles, others offering prayers. Sarah Miller clutched a photograph of her husband and son, her voice trembling as she told reporters, "John knows these trails. He's careful. He wouldn't let Daniel out of his sight. Something's wrong. Something happened to them out there." By the third day, the search had grown. The National Guard joined, thermal imaging equipment was deployed, and drones buzzed above the canopy. Rangers marked trees with tape. Volunteers marched shoulder to shoulder in lines, scanning every inch of ground. But the results were the same. Nothing. The Blue Ridge Mountains are vast, beautiful, and unforgiving. Weather shifts suddenly. Fog rolls in without warning. Trails splinter and vanish. Locals know this, but they also know the mountains carry a darker reputation. Over the decades, whispers have lingered of hunters who never returned. Hikers found weeks later, miles from where they were last seen, sometimes without shoes, sometimes without explanation. Some called it folklore. Others called it a curse. Still, the Miller case felt different. This wasn't an inexperienced tourist straying from the trail. John had hiked these mountains since he was young. He carried a compass, maps, supplies. Daniel had grown up in the outdoors. They were not careless, and yet the mountains had swallowed them whole. For weeks, their faces appeared on posters stapled to telephone poles, pinned to church bulletin boards, taped to the windows of gas stations. Missing: John Miller, 42, Daniel Miller, 14, last seen October 15th, Blue Ridge Mountains. The photographs showed John smiling with an arm around his son, Daniel with his baseball cap turned slightly to the side, shy but proud. Search efforts stretched into November. Helicopters returned empty. Dogs collapsed from exhaustion. Volunteers trudged home with blistered feet and haunted eyes. The sheriff gave regular press conferences, but each one was emptier than the last. "We are doing everything possible," he repeated. "At this time, we have no evidence of foul play. We remain hopeful." Hope was in short supply. By Thanksgiving, the case had gone cold. Snow dusted the peaks, covering whatever clues might have existed. Search teams withdrew. Reporters moved on, and the Miller family was left with silence. But silence does not erase memory. The story of John and Daniel lingered in the community, whispered in diners, recounted at church gatherings, taught as cautionary tales to new hikers. Raven's Hollow, the trailhead where they had begun their hike, became a place people avoided. Some said the woods felt wrong there, heavy with absence. The disappearance of John and Daniel Miller was not just another lost hiker story. It was something else, something no one could explain. And for 4 years, it remained that way. Until a drone, flying above those same mountains, captured something that would change everything. John Miller was the kind of man people trusted. At 42, he had built a life defined not by wealth or adventure, but by stability. He worked as an electrician in Asheville, North Carolina, often called out in storms to restore power to darkened homes. Neighbors remembered him as reliable, polite, the sort of man who waved from his truck on his way to work. But beneath that steady exterior was a love for the outdoors. John had grown up hiking the Blue Ridge with his own father. He said the forest was the one place that taught him patience and courage. "The woods don't lie," he once told a friend. "They show you who you are." It became a tradition he wanted to pass down to his children. Daniel Miller was 14 in 2018, just beginning the awkward stretch between boyhood and adulthood. Tall for his age, shy, and often more comfortable with video games than people, he wasn't the type to chase adventure. Yet, when his father suggested hikes, Daniel always went. Not because he loved the blisters or the long climbs, but because he loved the quiet time with John. Sarah Miller, John's wife, once explained it simply. Daniel was closest to his dad when they were in the woods. At home, he was distracted, buried in his phone. But out there, with no signal, no noise, he talked. He opened up. The October hike was supposed to be quick. One day out, a picnic, maybe a few hours of fishing in a stream before heading home. John had chosen Coldwater Gap because it wasn't remote, at least not by Blue Ridge standards. The trails were well marked, popular on weekends. Families hiked there. Couples went for picnics. It was the kind of place you expected to be safe. And that is what made their disappearance so difficult to understand. John was not inexperienced. He carried a compass, maps, a first aid kit, small details that investigators later confirmed in his truck. He never went unprepared. Friends said he could read the woods like a book. Daniel wasn't careless either. His teachers described him as cautious, observant. If anything, he was the type to stay close to his father, not wander off. This wasn't a reckless man dragging a reluctant boy into the wilderness. It was a father and son who had walked those mountains many times before. The path was familiar. The plan was simple. Yet sometime after 10:30 a.m., after being seen by another hiker near the trailhead, they were gone. The sheriff later said it was what troubled him most. "If they were strangers to these trails, I could believe they got lost. But John knew them. He taught his son to stick close. This wasn't an accident waiting to happen. This was something else." The Miller disappearance was not just a story of two missing hikers. It was the collapse of trust. The trust that experience, preparation, and love between father and son could protect them in the wild. And that is why the case haunted everyone who heard it. Because if John and Daniel Miller could vanish without a trace in the Blue Ridge, anyone could. October 15, 2018, started as a perfect day for hiking. The skies were clear, the air cool, the leaves of the Blue Ridge Mountains turning deep shades of crimson and gold. At around 9:45 a.m., a gas station clerk remembered John Miller stopping for supplies. He bought 2 bottles of water, a bag of trail mix, and filled the truck with gas. Daniel waited in the passenger seat, fiddling with his baseball cap. The clerk later described them as just a regular dad and son out for the day. Nothing unusual. By 10:20 a.m., they had parked near Coldwater Gap. A retired teacher named Margaret Hayes, herself a seasoned hiker, recalled seeing them unload their gear. She described John as friendly, polite, and Daniel as quiet, shy, like he didn't want to be noticed. She said John nodded to her, wished her a good hike, and then disappeared with his son onto the trail. At 10:30 a.m., another hiker, a man named David Carter, crossed paths with them on the first mile. He remembered it clearly. John walked ahead, holding a folded map in one hand. Daniel followed, adjusting the straps of his backpack. Carter even recalled John joking, "We'll make it back before my wife notices I forgot the cooler." Carter laughed, waved, and kept moving. That was the last confirmed sighting of the Millers. The trail they entered was not considered dangerous. It wound gently through forest, crossing streams and small ridges, eventually looping back toward the parking area. On weekends, it was often crowded, but on that Monday morning, the woods were quieter. By noon, clouds rolled in. A few scattered hikers passed along the ridge. None reported seeing John or Daniel again. No one remembered hearing calls for help or footsteps running through brush. At 3 p.m., when they should have been returning, the parking lot at Coldwater Gap was nearly empty. Their truck was still there, untouched. The driver's side window rolled halfway down, as if John had been in a hurry. By evening, Sarah Miller began calling. No answer. She assumed they had camped. But by the following morning, when John failed to show up for work and Daniel missed school, she drove to Coldwater Gap herself. The truck was still there, doors locked, no sign of them. The sheriff was notified at 11 a.m. on October 16th. Within hours, deputies and rangers entered the trail. By nightfall, helicopters circled, volunteers shouted their names into the darkness, and dogs ran frantic loops that led nowhere. The Asheville Times ran a headline that evening: "Father and son vanish on familiar trail. No trace found." What puzzled investigators immediately was the lack of evidence. Usually, missing hikers left some sign: footprints, wrappers, fire pits, even broken branches. But in this case, there was nothing. No scent trails, no camping site, no scraps of food, no clothing. It was as if John and Daniel Miller had stepped into the trees and never come back out. The official search for John and Daniel Miller began within hours of their truck being discovered at Coldwater Gap, October 16, 2018. Deputies from Buncombe County Sheriff's Office, supported by rangers from the Blue Ridge Parkway, organized a rapid response. They expected to find the pair quickly. Perhaps they had wandered off trail, maybe injured, but surely not far. This was not an isolated wilderness, hundreds of miles from civilization. These were mountains, threaded with trails, visited daily by hikers and tourists. By 2 p.m. that day, the first teams entered the woods. They carried radios, GPS devices, and search dogs. The air was crisp, clear, the kind of day when sound carries far. Names were shouted, whistles blown. John, Daniel. Voices echoed across the valleys. The only reply was the rustle of leaves and the occasional caw of a crow. By dusk, nothing had been found. At 7 p.m., helicopters from the North Carolina State Highway Patrol took to the skies. Their searchlights sliced through the darkening forest, sweeping over ridges and valleys. Thermal imaging cameras scanned for heat signatures. The results were disheartening. Deer, smaller animals, but no sign of the missing father and son. On October 17th, the search expanded. More than 60 volunteers joined deputies and rangers. They were assigned grids, moving shoulder to shoulder, marking trees with fluorescent tape to ensure no ground was left unchecked. A volunteer later recalled, "We covered every inch of those ridges. You'd think if a person had so much as dropped a gum wrapper, we'd have seen it. But there was nothing. Not a footprint. Not a sign." Dogs were brought in from Georgia and South Carolina, highly trained bloodhounds capable of following a scent for miles. Handlers gave them John's hat and Daniel's shirt from home. At first, the dogs picked up a trail near the truck. They pulled handlers down the first stretch of the trail, noses low, tails stiff, but within minutes, they circled in confusion, whining. The scent simply vanished. By the third day, more than 100 people were involved. Local churches delivered food. Boy Scout troops offered help. Farmers parked their tractors and joined the lines of searchers. For the first time in years, the community was united in a single purpose: bringing John and Daniel home. The Asheville Times reported on October 18th, "Search for father and son expands to 10 miles. Despite helicopters, dogs, and volunteers, no trace of John and Daniel Miller has been discovered." Sheriff Brewer called the lack of evidence deeply troubling and admitted investigators were baffled by the case. By October 19th, rain swept across the Blue Ridge. Cold, steady, relentless. Trails turned to rivers of mud. Streams swelled dangerously. Volunteers trudged back soaked to the bone, their boots heavy, their spirits heavier. That night, inside the Miller home, Sarah sat in the living room surrounded by neighbors. On the table lay a Bible, its pages turned to the Book of Psalms. Candles flickered against the window. She whispered to a reporter, "I can feel they're out there. I can feel it. But the mountains won't let them go." On October 20th, the National Guard arrived with specialized equipment: night vision goggles, infrared scanners, drones. The drones hummed over the canopy, cameras capturing every detail. But even with modern technology, the mountains yielded nothing. Sheriff Brewer stood before microphones and said, "We have searched more than 25 square miles. We have scoured ridges, ravines, caves, and streams. At this point, we have not located a single item belonging to John or Daniel Miller. No backpack, no clothing, no campsite, no footprints, nothing." On October 22nd, after a week of searching, rumors began to swirl. Some volunteers claimed they heard strange sounds at night in the woods, faint whistles, distant voices. Others dismissed it as imagination, the mind playing tricks in the dark. One volunteer told a local station, "Every time I thought I heard something, footsteps, a cough, I'd rush over and there'd be nothing. Just silence. The mountains have a way of making you believe things that aren't there." By October 23rd, exhaustion set in. Dogs collapsed from overwork, their handlers kneeling in the mud beside them. Helicopter pilots reported turbulence, too dangerous to fly in worsening weather. Volunteers began dropping out, their own families demanding they come home. The Asheville Times headline read, "8 days, still nothing. Search for Millers grows desperate." On October 25th, 10 days after the disappearance, the search was scaled back. Deputies remained, a small team of rangers continued, but the massive volunteer lines were dismissed. The command post, once buzzing with radios and maps pinned to corkboards, now sat half empty. Sarah Miller refused to leave. She slept in her car at Coldwater Gap, wrapped in blankets, waiting for a call that never came. Her sister later said, she thought if she stayed close, she'd feel them coming back. She couldn't stand the idea of being far away. By November, snow dusted the ridges. the search was officially suspended. The final statement from Sheriff Brewer read, "We have exhausted all resources available to us. At this time, we have no evidence to indicate what happened to John and Daniel Miller. This case remains open." For the Miller family, the words, "no evidence," cut deeper than any confirmation of tragedy. Evidence could be explained. Evidence could lead to closure. But silence was endless, and silence was all the mountains gave. When the official search was suspended in November 2018, the case of John and Daniel Miller shifted from a rescue operation into a mystery. The absence of evidence created a void, and in that void, theories began to grow like weeds. Some theories were whispered in church basements, others shouted on local radio stations, and still others published in online forums where strangers dissected every known detail. None were proven, but all of them reflected the desperation of a community trying to explain the unexplainable. The accident theory. The first and simplest explanation was that John and Daniel had suffered an accident. The Blue Ridge Mountains are beautiful, but unforgiving. Hidden ravines cut through the forest. Sinkholes open without warning. Streams swell into torrents after sudden rains. Even experienced hikers can make a single mistake that leads to disaster. Supporters of this theory pointed out that no one truly knows how far the Millers ventured after 10:30 a.m. Perhaps they left the main trail, chasing a view or exploring a shortcut. A misstep, a loose rock, or a slip into a gully could have left them injured, unable to call for help. In October, the days are warm, but nights drop cold. Hypothermia can claim lives quickly. "It doesn't take long," one ranger explained. "If you're hurt and can't move, the cold will do the rest." But this theory left glaring holes. If John and Daniel had fallen, why wasn't anything found? No broken branches, no scattered gear, no trace of their packs or clothing. Searchers scoured ravines with ropes, combed creek beds, and rappelled into caves. Nothing. Not even a boot print. The Asheville Times interviewed retired ranger Thomas Green, who said, "I've seen accidents. I've found people days later, sometimes alive, sometimes not. But you always find something. A trail, a piece of clothing, an imprint in the mud. The Miller case isn't an accident. You don't just disappear without a trace." The animal attack theory. Another possibility was an animal attack. The Blue Ridge is home to black bears, bobcats, and coyotes. While attacks on humans are rare, they are not impossible. A startled bear could strike. Coyotes sometimes circle camps at night, yet experts were skeptical. Attacks leave evidence: blood, torn clothing, drag marks. None were found. Wildlife biologist Karen Lowe said, "If a bear had taken them, we'd know. Bears don't erase footprints. They don't bury gear in perfect silence. The woods tell stories after an attack. In this case, the woods are mute." Still, fear spread. Parents warned children not to hike alone. Hunters carried rifles more visibly that season. Some claimed they heard strange growls near Coldwater Gap. "Something's out there," one man told a local radio host. "Maybe it wasn't a bear we know." That comment sparked wilder rumors, whispered suggestions of something unknown, something that stalked the mountains. The stranger theory. The most disturbing theory was that John and Daniel encountered another person in the woods. Coldwater Gap is not isolated. Trails are frequented by locals and tourists alike. Anyone could have been there that morning: a drifter, a hunter, someone living off the grid. If the Millers crossed paths with the wrong individual, foul play was possible. But investigators found no tire tracks near the trailhead, no reports of suspicious figures. Still, the idea persisted. A caller to Asheville AM radio put it bluntly: "You mean to tell me two people just walked into the woods and never came back?" No. Somebody was waiting for them. Somebody out there knows exactly what happened. Some speculated about backwoods squatters, hermits who didn't want to be discovered. Others spoke of fugitives hiding in the hills. One rumor claimed a white pickup truck had been seen parked near the trailhead the day of the disappearance. Deputies investigated, but found nothing to confirm it. The stranger theory stuck because of one unsettling truth. In a world without evidence, a human presence seemed more likely than nature erasing everything. The voluntary disappearance theory. Then there was the theory few wanted to believe, that John had chosen not to come back. Every disappearance carries whispers of voluntary flight. Some suggested John was under financial pressure. Others hinted at marriage troubles. If true, had he taken Daniel and vanished deliberately, planning a new life somewhere else? Sarah Miller dismissed the idea outright. My husband wouldn't leave me. He wouldn't leave his daughter. He loved us. He loved Daniel. He had no debts, no secrets. Anyone who says otherwise doesn't know him. Investigators found no evidence of financial issues, no secret accounts, no hidden plans. John's life was unremarkably steady. Bills were paid. His job was secure. His marriage, by all accounts, was stable. But some insisted. Online forums debated endlessly. Why was the driver's side window rolled halfway down on the truck? Why had John packed more gear than needed for a single-day hike? Was he planning something longer? In the absence of answers, suspicion turned to even the most ordinary details. The supernatural whisper. Though rarely spoken aloud, another theory circulated quietly in Asheville, one that had nothing to do with accidents, animals, or strangers. The Blue Ridge has long carried legends. Stories of phantom lights drifting through valleys, voices calling names in the night, travelers who vanish only to reappear miles away with no memory of time lost. Folklore clings to the ridges like mist. Older residents muttered that the Millers had stumbled into the thin places, where the world grows strange. Campfire tales spoke of travelers swallowed by fog, never to return. Most dismissed such talk as fantasy, but in online communities, the whispers grew louder. What if they didn't just disappear? One poster asked. What if the mountains took them? For Sarah Miller, these theories were torture. They talk about accidents, about bears, about strangers, but none of that brings them back. None of that tells me where my husband and son are. The void. By the end of 2018, no theory had gained ground. Each had supporters. Each had flaws. Accidents leave evidence. Animals leave trails. Strangers leave footprints. Voluntary disappearances leave clues. Folklore leaves only fear. But in the case of John and Daniel Miller, there was nothing. No evidence. No trail. No closure. Just silence in the mountains. When the official search for John and Daniel Miller ended, silence took its place. For families of the missing, silence is the cruelest fate. It does not give the relief of grief, nor the clarity of truth. It only stretches, day after day, year after year, until it feels heavier than death itself. In Asheville, the Miller home became a place frozen in time. John's work boots remained by the door, laces tied neatly. His tool belt hung in the garage, untouched. Daniel's baseball cap sat on his desk, his notebooks stacked as if waiting for homework to be finished. Sarah Miller refused to move a thing. If I change the house, she told a reporter in 2019, then it's like I'm admitting they're not coming back. 2019. The first year. The first anniversary brought candles and tears. Neighbors gathered outside the Miller home, holding photographs of John and Daniel. A pastor prayed. Children from Daniel's school released balloons into the night sky. Sarah stood at the center, clutching a framed photo of her husband and son, whispering, "Come home." That same year, a hiker in Tennessee reported seeing a man and a boy who looked just like the Millers near a rest stop. Deputies investigated. Surveillance footage was checked. It wasn't them. False leads cut deep. Each one carried hope. and each one left scars when it collapsed. 2020, the second year. By the second year, the story had faded from headlines. The Asheville Times ran a small piece on page 4. Family still seeks answers in disappearance of John and Daniel Miller. It was little more than a summary of old facts, but Sarah refused to let the silence consume her. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, to state officials, to federal agencies, to anyone who might reopen the case. Most went unanswered. A few sent polite condolences. None brought progress. At vigils, fewer people attended. Neighbors still cared, but life pressed on. New stories filled the news. New tragedies demanded attention. For Sarah, the world seemed to move on without her. 2021, the third year. The third year brought something new and cruel. A group of so-called citizen investigators on an online forum began speculating that John had staged his disappearance. They wrote long posts about supposed financial troubles, about a marriage under strain. None of it was true, but rumors spread faster than corrections. Sarah wept when she read the posts. "They don't know my husband," she said in an interview. "He loved his family. He loved Daniel. He wouldn't leave us." Still, the whispers lingered. In diners, at gas stations, strangers debated not whether the Millers were dead, but whether they had chosen to vanish. Meanwhile, new hikers in the Blue Ridge began telling their own stories. A couple claimed they heard footsteps pacing outside their tent at night. Another hiker reported finding strange carvings on a tree near Coldwater Gap. Rangers dismissed it all as imagination, but the rumors spread. Maybe the mountains were hiding something. 2022, the fourth year. By the fourth year, the Miller disappearance had become less a case and more a legend. Tour guides mentioned it as a cautionary tale. Teenagers dared each other to camp near Coldwater Gap. Online, the case became fuel for podcasts and late-night radio shows. But for Sarah, there was no legend, only loss. Each October, she lit 2 candles in her window, one for her husband, one for her son. She sat by the glow until morning, whispering their names into the dark. That same October, a break finally came. Not from the sheriff's office, not from the FBI, but from an unlikely source, a hobbyist flying a drone. He wasn't looking for evidence. He was testing his equipment, capturing footage of autumn leaves glowing red and gold over the Blue Ridge. But when he reviewed the video later, frame by frame, he froze. In one clearing, half hidden by trees, was something he couldn't explain. A collapsed tent, a flash of color, something that should not have been there. It was October 2022, almost exactly 4 years after John and Daniel Miller vanished without a trace in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The discovery began with something simple: a hobbyist testing his drone. Brian Cooper, a 34-year-old IT technician from Asheville, often spent his weekends exploring the mountains with his new DJI drone. He wasn't searching for mysteries or chasing legends. He wanted footage of autumn foliage, the brilliant reds and golds that painted the Blue Ridge every October. He launched his drone near Coldwater Gap, the very trailhead where the Miller's truck had been found 4 years earlier. The drone climbed, its camera sweeping across valleys and ridges. For nearly an hour, Cooper filmed the landscape, streams flashing in the sun, ridges fading into haze, the endless forest canopy shifting in the wind. Nothing seemed unusual. It wasn't until later that evening, reviewing the footage frame by frame on his computer, that he noticed it. In a clearing, half hidden by branches and shadows, was a shape that didn't belong. Rectangular, pale, with sharp angles. At first, he thought it was just rocks, but as he zoomed in, the image sharpened. Torn fabric stretched over bent poles, a collapsed tent. Next to it, a patch of faded red, a backpack, or what was left of one. Cooper sat back, heart racing. For years, he'd read about the Miller case in local papers. Posters with their faces still clung to telephone poles. Candlelight vigils were still held every October. And now, on his computer screen, he stared at something that could change everything. He debated for hours whether to call it in. Finally, he sent the footage to the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. On October 11th, deputies returned to Coldwater Gap with GPS coordinates in hand. For the first time in 4 years, search teams hiked into those woods with purpose. Reporters gathered near the trailhead, cameras ready, as word spread that something had been found. The clearing was not far, less than 2 miles from the main trail. Yet dense undergrowth had hidden it, and from above, the tent blended with rocks and leaves. What they found chilled everyone present. The tent was indeed there, collapsed and covered by years of moss and fallen leaves. Its poles bent, its fabric torn by weather and time. Inside were the remnants of 2 sleeping bags, both shredded. A cracked flashlight lay in the dirt, its casing rusted. And next to the tent, tangled in roots, was a red backpack, its zipper corroded, its contents ruined by water. But the most disturbing find was small and leather-bound. A notebook. It lay half buried beneath leaves, its cover warped and softened by years of damp. Pages stuck together, but words still visible in faded ink. Investigators lifted it carefully, sealed it in evidence bags, and carried it out like a sacred artifact. The notebook belonged to Daniel Miller. That night, the Asheville Times ran a headline that sent shockwaves through North Carolina. Notebook found near Coldwater. Gap believed to belong to missing teen Daniel Miller. Inside, early entries described ordinary things: sketches of trees, lists of songs, simple thoughts of a 14-year-old boy. But the final entries were different. One read, "Dad says we're close to the trail, but I don't see it. He says we should stay calm." Another, dated October 15th, 2018. "I hear something outside the tent. Dad says it's just animals, but it sounds like footsteps." And the final page, smeared but legible enough to chill the reader. "Someone is walking around our camp." The reaction was immediate. Sarah Miller was called to the sheriff's office to identify the notebook. She collapsed when she saw it. "That's Daniel's handwriting," she whispered. "That's my son." The discovery reignited the story nationwide. Television crews descended on Asheville. True crime podcasts dedicated entire series to the case. Social media exploded with theories, dissecting Daniel's words. Who was walking around their camp? An animal? A stranger? Someone watching them? Sheriff Alan Brewer held a press conference. "At this time, we can confirm that items consistent with camping gear were found near Coldwater Gap. Among them was a notebook believed to belong to Daniel Miller. The contents of the notebook are being analyzed by forensic experts. We cannot comment further at this time." Reporters shouted questions. Were remains found? Was there evidence of foul play? Brewer refused to answer. Rumors filled the silence. Some claimed bones were found near the tent, but hidden from the public. Others swore the tent looked planted, staged to be discovered only years later. Online forums lit up with speculation. If the tent was only 2 miles from the trail, how did search teams miss it in 2018? Why did bloodhounds lose the scent so quickly? Was the notebook a genuine artifact from 2018, or placed later? One local resident told a reporter, "You don't just miss a tent that close to the trail. We searched those woods with hundreds of people. Either somebody hid it too well, or it wasn't there when we looked." For Sarah Miller, the discovery was both relief and torment. Relief that something tangible had finally been found. Torment because it raised more questions than answers. She held a vigil the following night, clutching the notebook in its plastic case. "This is Daniel's voice," she said. "This is his last message. He was afraid, and I want to know why." National outlets picked up the story. CNN aired a segment titled, "Blue Ridge Mystery: Father and Son Missing for 4 Years. Teen's Notebook Found. The New York Times published a feature piece exploring the long history of disappearances in the Appalachians. One expert told the Times, "This case strikes people because it's not just about two missing hikers. It's about the silence around them. And now, with this notebook, we hear a voice again, a boy's voice, and it tells us something we can't ignore." Theories multiplied overnight. Some insisted it was proof of abduction. Others said Daniel had been frightened by ordinary noises, a raccoon, a deer, and his words had taken on too much weight. Skeptics argued the entire site looked suspiciously staged. But one truth remained. After 4 years of silence, the case of John and Daniel Miller was alive again, and the words in Daniel's notebook echoed across every conversation. "Someone is walking around our camp." After the clearing was secured, investigators treated it like a fresh crime scene, despite the 4 years that had passed. Evidence markers dotted the ground. Photographs were taken from every angle, and every object, no matter how weathered, was cataloged, bagged, and carried out. The items were transferred to a federal forensic lab for detailed analysis. For weeks, the public heard nothing. The sheriff's office repeated the same line. The investigation is ongoing. But silence only fueled speculation. When information began to leak, it painted a picture both haunting and inconclusive. The tent. The tent was a standard two-person model, mid-range, not unusual. Weathering showed it had been exposed for years. Fabric brittle, seams torn. Its collapse suggested it had not been disturbed by humans in a long time, but rather by storms, snow, and fallen branches. Inside were the remains of 2 sleeping bags. They were shredded, though experts couldn't determine whether by animals, weather, or something else. One bore faint reddish stains. When questioned, officials declined to confirm whether it was blood. A retired ranger familiar with the analysis told a local journalist, "If it was animal damage, they'd say so. The fact they won't tell us what those stains are, that says a lot." The backpack. The red backpack, found just outside the tent, was identified as John Miller's. Inside were ruined supplies, wrappers from protein bars, a corroded pocket knife, a compass, and a water bottle half filled with murky liquid. What disturbed investigators was the compass. Its glass was cracked, its needle frozen at an angle. Whether damaged by accident or force, no one could say. But to some, it symbolized the entire case, a tool meant to guide, broken and useless in the moment it was needed most. The flashlight. The flashlight, cracked and rusted, still contained batteries. Forensic swabs were taken. Rumors spread quickly that degraded fingerprints were lifted from the casing. The sheriff's office refused to confirm, citing ongoing analysis. One anonymous source claimed partial impressions were present, but too degraded for identification. That word, impressions, fueled endless speculation online. Whose hands had touched it last? The notebook. The notebook was the centerpiece of the discovery. Its leather cover was warped, edges eaten by damp and mold. Yet dozens of pages remained legible. Earlier entries were ordinary. Lists of songs, sketches of birds, notes about the hike. Dad says we're making good time. The trees here look older than anywhere else. But the last entries chilled investigators. October 14th. We lost the trail for a bit, but Dad says we're fine. October 15th. I hear something outside the tent. Dad says it's just animals, but it sounds like footsteps. Final entry. Someone is walking around our camp. Handwriting experts confirmed the writing matched Daniel's known school assignments. The words were his. For Sarah Miller, the notebook was a message across time. "It's my son's voice," she said. "It's the last thing he told us. He was afraid, and we have to believe him." Soil and surroundings. Forensic geologists studied the soil around the tent. Their findings sparked more questions. The soil showed disturbance not just from 2018, but possibly later. Layers suggested something had been shifted or dug again within the past 2 years. Was the tent moved? Was the site tampered with? Officials downplayed the finding, saying heavy rains and erosion could cause similar patterns, but locals didn't buy it. "You don't mistake weather for a shovel," one volunteer searcher said. Rumors of bones. Though never officially confirmed, whispers began immediately that bones had been found near the site. Some claimed small fragments were collected. Others swore they saw body bags carried discreetly from the clearing. Officials denied it. Sheriff Brewer stated bluntly, "At this time, no human remains have been recovered." But in Asheville, denial only fed suspicion. One resident told a reporter, "If they found nothing, why all the secrecy? Why shut down the site so fast?" Contradictions. The discovery site was just 2 miles from the main trail. In 2018, that area had been searched repeatedly by volunteers, dogs, and helicopters. How could an entire tent, backpacks, and supplies have been missed? A former volunteer voiced what many thought. "We walked those woods shoulder to shoulder. Don't tell me we missed a tent that close to the trail. Either it was hidden too well, or it wasn't there then." Theories bloomed. Some believed the tent was there all along, overlooked in the chaos of 2018. Others swore it was planted later, staged to look old, to mislead investigators. A few whispered about cover-ups, that authorities had known about the site, but chose to keep it quiet until now. The public response news outlets framed the evidence as both breakthrough and mystery. CNN ran, "Notebook found, but questions grow." The New York Times asked, "How could search teams miss a tent?" Podcasters dissected every item. Online forums debated endlessly. Was the notebook proof of abduction? Was the frozen compass symbolic or suspicious? Were the stains blood? And if so, whose? For Sarah Miller, the details mattered less than the truth. She sat before reporters, holding the plastic bag that contained her son's notebook, and said, "I just want to know what happened. My husband and my son deserved better than to disappear into silence. And now we finally hear Daniel's voice again. I need answers." The evidence gave the case new life, but instead of clarity, it delivered only more contradictions. A broken compass, a stained sleeping bag, a flashlight with possible fingerprints, and a boy's final words, written before vanishing forever. "Someone is walking around our camp." The discovery of the campsite in 2022 should have brought clarity. Instead, it reignited every doubt, every rumor, every theory that had haunted the case from the start. Now there was new evidence: a tent, a backpack, a flashlight, a notebook, and each object became fuel for competing explanations. The Blue Ridge Mountains once again became the backdrop for debates that stretched from Asheville diners to national newsrooms to late-night podcasts. Everyone had an answer. No one had the truth. Theory 1. The accident revisited. For some, the simplest explanation remained the most believable. John and Daniel had gotten lost, set up camp, and succumbed to nature. Perhaps John injured himself, leaving them stranded. Perhaps cold nights in October claimed them before help could arrive. The tent, the sleeping bags, the backpack, all seemed to fit. But critics pushed back. If they had died from exposure, where were the bodies? Why no bones? No clothing remnants outside the tent? Rangers explained that scavenging animals could scatter remains, and 4 years of weather might erase more than most people imagined. Still, the notebook complicated matters. Daniel wrote not of cold, not of hunger, but of footsteps. "Someone is walking around our camp." That single line cast a shadow over the accident theory. Theory 2. Animal attack. The stains on the sleeping bags, the shredded fabric, the missing remains. To some, this pointed toward an animal. Black bears, coyotes, even feral hogs. Local hunters supported the idea. One said in an interview, "A bear could drag them off. Scatter bones. After 4 years, you wouldn't find much. But biologists disagreed. Wildlife leaves patterns. Drag marks, feeding sites, gnawed bones. None were reported. And again, the notebook. If Daniel heard footsteps, why would he describe them as human-like? Not growls, not scratching, not snuffling sounds. Theory 3. The stranger. This became the dominant theory after 2022. Daniel's notebook was damning in its simplicity. Someone is walking around our camp. Not something. Someone. Podcasters seized on the line. Forums dissected it word by word. Who was that someone? A passing hiker? A hermit living off the grid? A predator looking for victims? Theories blossomed. A drifter had been hiding in the Blue Ridge, preying on campers. An escaped convict from another state had found refuge in the mountains. A local with knowledge of the search area planted the tent to throw investigators off. The problem was evidence. No tire tracks, no confirmed sightings, no suspects. But absence itself fueled the idea. Only a human could erase a trail so completely, one online sleuth argued. Animals don't cover their tracks. People do. Theory 4. The staged scene. Skeptics argued the campsite itself was suspicious. How could volunteers, dogs, helicopters, and drones miss a tent only 2 miles from the trail in 2018? The tent was large, the backpack bright red. Even under leaves, it seemed improbable that hundreds of searchers overlooked it. This led to a darker theory. The scene was staged. Some believed the tent had been moved later, placed in the clearing after the original searches ended. Others suggested the notebook might not even date from 2018, that it had been planted to mislead. The soil analysis, showing disturbance not just in 2018, but possibly later, fueled this suspicion. If someone returned to the site years after the disappearance, why? To move evidence? To create a false trail? Sarah Miller rejected the idea of forgery. "That's Daniel's handwriting," she said firmly. "I know my son's words." But the whispers persisted. Theory 5. The cover-up. With contradictions came conspiracies. Some locals insisted law enforcement had known about the site earlier, but kept it secret. Others accused the FBI of hiding evidence, especially after rumors of bones spread. One retired volunteer was quoted anonymously. "We walked those woods shoulder to shoulder. That tent wasn't there. Don't tell me we missed it. Somebody's lying." Talk shows and online forums amplified these suspicions. Why had the sheriff refused to comment on the stains? Why deny remains were found? Why was the notebook released to the public so quickly, but other details kept hidden? To believers, it was proof of a cover-up. Perhaps someone powerful was involved. Perhaps a suspect was protected. Or perhaps authorities simply didn't want to admit their failure. Theory 6. The unexplainable. And then there were those who turned to the strange. The Blue Ridge has always carried folklore, stories of ghost lights, voices in the fog, thin places where the world slips. With Daniel's words, the supernatural whispers grew louder. Someone is walking around our camp. To some, that someone was not human. Forums speculated about spirits, legends, even disappearances linked to other cases in the Appalachians. Most dismissed it as fantasy, but the legend of the Miller case became a magnet for ghost hunters, YouTubers, and late-night radio shows. And every October, new hikers swore they heard footsteps outside their tents. The divide. The discovery divided Asheville and beyond. Some clung to the accident theory, needing to believe John and Daniel had simply lost their way. Others swore the notebook proved human involvement. Still others insisted the entire site was staged, part of a larger conspiracy. Every theory left wounds. If it was an accident, John had failed his son. If it was an attack, their last moments were terror. If it was staged, then truth itself had been buried. The Asheville Times summed it up in an editorial. This case is no longer just about a missing father and son. It is about trust. Trust in nature, trust in authorities, trust in evidence. And trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore. The Blue Ridge Mountains stand as they always have, ridges rising like waves, forests stretching endless, mist curling through the valleys. To most who visit, they are breathtaking. To those who remember John and Daniel Miller, they are something else entirely, a place that swallowed 2 lives and offered only fragments in return. 4 years of silence ended with a collapsed tent, a broken compass, a flashlight, a red backpack, and a boy's notebook. These were the objects the mountains finally gave back. But they were not answers. They were echoes. Sarah Miller still lives in the same house in Asheville. Neighbors say she leaves the porch light on every night, as though guiding her husband and son home. The boots by the door remain. Daniel's cap still rests on his desk. She keeps the notebook in a box by her bed, sometimes reading the final lines aloud in a whisper, as if saying them enough times might unlock their meaning. She told a reporter in 2023, "I don't care about theories anymore. Accident, animal, stranger, whatever people say. I just want to know if they were afraid at the end. If my son was scared. If my husband tried to protect him. That's what I live with every day." Her words cut deeper than speculation. Behind every headline, every podcast, every theory is the absence of 2 people who once laughed, breathed, and belonged to someone. The town in Asheville, the Miller case became both wound and legend. At diners, older residents still lower their voices when the subject comes up. Teenagers dare each other to hike to Coldwater Gap at night, whispering about footsteps outside tents. Tourists ask rangers about the father and son who disappeared here. The sheriff's office maintains the file is open, but locals say it feels more like a memorial than an investigation. Each October, vigils are still held, candles flickering against the chill, photographs of John and Daniel glowing in the dark. The Asheville Times continues to run anniversary stories. Headlines now read, 5 years later, still no answers. 7 years later, the notebook that haunts the Blue Ridge. The words change, but the emptiness remains. The lingering questions. Why was the tent only 2 miles from the trail, and yet overlooked by hundreds of searchers in 2018? Why did the dogs lose the scent so quickly, as if it had evaporated into the air? What stained the sleeping bag? Why was the compass broken, its needle frozen? Why did Daniel, in his final words, describe not cold or hunger, but footsteps? And above all, who was walking around their camp? A mystery without closure. For true crime enthusiasts, the case has become a puzzle, each piece debated endlessly. For the Miller family, it remains a hole that can never be filled. Without remains, there can be no closure. Without truth, there can be no peace. The mountains hold their secret tightly, and the silence between the ridges is deafening. One ranger, interviewed years later, said quietly, "I've worked search and rescue for 20 years. You always find something. Always. But with the Millers, it's like the woods didn't want to give them back." Legend and fear. The story has outgrown the facts. Campers claim to hear footsteps circling their tents at night. Some say compasses spin uselessly near Coldwater Gap. Others swear they've seen a man and a boy in the distance, only for them to vanish when approached. Most dismiss it as folklore, just stories told in the dark. But in Asheville, when fog settles over the mountains and the trees sway in the wind, even skeptics admit to unease. Because stories begin somewhere. And this one began with a father and son, a truck at a trailhead, and silence. The last words. Every theory, every headline, every rumor collapses back to one thing. The notebook. A 14-year-old boy, writing by flashlight inside a tent, trying to make sense of what he heard outside. Someone is walking around our camp. It is the only direct voice we have from that night. the final trace of Daniel Miller. Words that carry fear, innocence, and mystery all at once. The Blue Ridge Mountains remain quiet, offering no answers. Theories continue to clash, and the truth is buried somewhere between ridges and silence. But the boy's words echo still, carried on every wind that blows through Coldwater Gap, whispered in every conversation about the case. Someone was there, someone was watching, and no one knows who.